The Rings of Power Season 2 officially makes Elrond Middle-earth's smartest character, and the Amazon series only has to continue his Lord of the Rings story to do so. Robert Aramayo's Elrond is one of the most interesting Lord of the Rings characters to appear in Amazon's Rings of Power, and is certainly the easiest to root for. Galadriel plays into Sauron's schemes and can be too brash, while Isildur is impulsive. Even Gandalf feels like a totally different character, but Elrond is a breath of fresh air, even if is also a far cry from his LOTR counterpart. Elrond's differences in the Rings of Power have a good explanation, however, as the creators are showing how he becomes the wise and stoic Lord of Rivendell we meet in LOTR. The Rings of Power Season 2's ending is already setting the stage for Rivendell's creation, and it also highlights Elrond's wisdom. In fact, the entire sophomore season of Amazon's Lord of the Rings show proves that Elrond is wise beyond his years. Even as his elders ignore the risks that come with the Rings of Power, Elrond raises the alarm about them. Elrond's determination to destroy the Rings of Power makes him Middle-earth's smartest character. He begs Galadriel and Gil-galad to get rid of them. The best thing Elrond has done in the Rings of Power is reject the titular rings, an act that makes him smarter and more disciplined than anyone else on the show. Galadriel and Celebrimbor are both deceived by Sauron, and Galadriel becomes influenced by her own Ring of Power, even knowing where Nenya comes from. While the 311 rings aren't corrupted by Sauron like the dwarf's rings are, Galadriel doesn't even take time to consider the consequences of using them. Even Gil-galad barely concerns himself about the risks, and Círdan is drawn to them as well. By contrast, Elrond is vocal about destroying the Rings of Power, insisting the elves get rid of them rather than use them to prolong their time in Middle-earth. Even as Galadriel and Gil-galad come to the conclusion that they need their power, Elrond devises a plan to take matters into his own hands. Unfortunately, seeking help from Círdan the shipwright doesn't result in the outcome he wants, but it's a noble effort, one that makes up for Elrond's biggest Lord of the Rings mistake. Of all the characters we've met in the Rings of Power, Elrond is probably the smartest, and his sentiments about the rings prove as much. Durin 4 also questions the rings, though he doesn't work as hard to destroy them. The Rings of Power Season 2 also hints that he could have a change of heart, eventually wearing one of the Rings of Power that corrupted his father. We know from the source material that Elrond will eventually inherit Gil-galad's Vilya, but his skepticism about the three also seems to be a spin on Tolkien's writings. Elrond's stance on the rings comes from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. He wants Isildur to destroy the One Ring in the source material. Elrond covered in ash in Mount Doom in The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Elrond's stance on the Rings of Power may seem surprising as the other characters cave to their influence, but his reaction comes from J.R.R. Tolkien's books. While the source material doesn't depict Elrond fighting with Galadriel over the three, it does see him telling Isildur to destroy the One Ring. This happens in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies as well, albeit in a far more dramatic fashion. The scene where Elrond begs Isildur to cast it into the fire at Mount Doom is representative of the advice he gave Aragorn's ancestor in the Second Age, and it appears the Rings of Power is also putting its own spin on this moment by having Elrond exhibit skepticism towards the Rings of Power. He already seems to be changing his mind, as he saves Galadriel with one of them at the end of Season 2. But he's the most hesitant to use the objects, and he's right to be. While the three don't turn out to be corrupted by Sauron, they easily could have been. The fact that he's the only one of the elves who speaks up about this and resists their draw says a lot about his character. Círdan and Gil-galad being pro-rings shows how smart Elrond really was. Even two of the wisest elders don't give the three enough thought. Further highlighting that Elrond is the smartest character in Amazon's LOTR show is the fact that neither Gil-galad nor Círdan have reservations about the Rings of Power, even though they're supposed to be the wisest of the elves. It's somewhat surprising that Elrond is able to resist temptation and question the objects more than these elders. However, with the Rings of Power downplaying Gil-galad's strengths, viewers shouldn't be so. Gil-galad would have to accept a Ring of Power eventually, but he could have heeded Elrond's concerns before coming to a decision. Círdan at least does this, though even being one of the oldest elves doesn't stop him from taking Narya. Círdan's character is also vocal about the potential risks of the Rings of Power in Tolkien's Legendarium, but only Elrond is so outspoken in the show. This suggests Aramayo's version of the character is even wiser than the esteemed elvish leaders, making his character even more special in the Rings of Power. Elrond being special makes sense, just look at his parents. Eärendil and Elwing were legendary figures. Elrond, Robert Aramayo, gives Galadriel's ring to the High King in The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power Season 2 Episode 5. While some may take issue with the Rings of Power building Elrond up as this incredibly wise and special character, it does fit with who he becomes later on. It also makes sense when you consider who his parents are. Eärendil and Elwing both have prominent roles in the history of Middle-earth, becoming known for great feats that set Elrond up for greatness himself. Elrond's father became a legendary figure for sailing to Valinor and requesting help in the fight against Morgoth, defeating Ancalagan the Black, Morgotha's dragon, and carrying the Evening Star.